So the Abigail Smith hooked mat, in brief, the story behind it coming to the New Brunswick Museum. It's been at the New Brunswick Museum since 1944, and actually it was brought to our attention because it was actually for sale at an antique dealer in Maine. And it had made its way to Maine because somebody was confused about Maryland, and there was the thought that it was an American piece.
Because New Maryland is on the...
Because it says New Maryland on it, and so they thought of the state of Maryland in the United States, and so thought it would be probably much more saleable in an American market. Yeah. But it was found, in fact, after it was traced a bit, that it came from New Brunswick, and we put out a call, and two very generous ladies donated the money for us to purchase it, which was quite something. It was 1944, right in the sort of the depths of the Second World War. Yeah. Not a lot of extra money around. In fact, part of the museum had been commandeered as a headquarters for the army in St. John. So we part of our space was occupied. So it has an interesting history that way. It my first engagement, if you want, with the Abigail Smith hooked mat was the request from the Heritage Ruck Hooking Guild for the 1995 exhibition in Fredericton, and so we coordinated. We looked at the mat because it was extremely fragile. It's done on a piece of burlap. Or jute. It's hard to tell exactly. We argue about it all the time. And it had some repairs, as I recall, when we originally looked at it, that we had to make some decisions about because they were causing the modern repairs that had been done, I think, before it, while it was still at the dealers. In the 1940s, there were some pieces of newer burlap that had been attached to the back with some hooking through the original burlap, and it was actually damaging it. So we had to remove that, and because the piece was so fragile, we didn't really even want to roll it because we were afraid that the burlap would give out. So we built a sort of a shadow box case for it and loaded it into the back of a station wagon. And I remember taking it up to the National Exhibition Centre, as it was then, taking it into the exhibition, and I keep telling everyone it was almost like a church. People were, genuflecting, and it was, people were sort of in awe of this object that they had for years heard about and had read because it was illustrated in articles and books on the history of hooked mats. And so, to me, really, that was one of the sort of most profound moments for me in understanding how much power an object like that could have for people, what they understood and why they wanted to do things and why they were part of an ongoing tradition. I remember as well on the way back from Fredericton, because it was just there for the day. Yeah. That's what we had decided, because the environmental conditions were an issue. It was in February, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, it was.
And so on the way back, I had this terrible car problem. I was at the Petersville Hill driving back from Fredericton to St. John, and all of the lights on the dash flashed, and I looked in the rearview mirror, and there was this huge cloud of smoke, and I thought to myself, do I save myself or do I save the mat? Well, I have to save the mat because I'll be killed if I don't save the mat. So fortunately, it wasn't a huge problem. It was a very cold wait for the tow truck to come and get the car, if you can imagine, and dark out in the middle of Petersville Hill.
Yes.
carrying the hook mat to back to St. John.
Yes, and I remember him telling this story, and I was thinking to myself, we wouldn't kill you. We'd just attack you with hooks and scissors.
So I have a very close relationship with the Abigail Smith hooked mat, going back over 20 years now.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's even longer than that.
It is.
And so I think it was at that exhibition where we floated the idea, because it was so fragile, of making a replica or a reproduction, so that everything that was good about the Abigail Smith could be shared in a number of different ways by having a replica available.
Yeah. And people that came to that exhibit, some of them, you remember there was one person that thought she was related to Abigail Smith.
Yes.
That's another story.
Yes.
But people were really interested in, of course, you have the whole rug hooking community, which wasn't huge then, but it was enough to get that feeling of almost reverence when he came in with it. Anyway, we had fun. We decided to do the replica, and it took 2.5 years. And of course, part of that was coming back here to the museum to do some research. The motifs that we could tell, I looked up in catalogs, old catalogs, she found them for me, in old ladies' magazines and that sort of thing. So some of the motifs we could decide were actually from samplers, but that's about all. And then we worried about the dove, what it meant on the Abigail Smith, and the American eagle. That was the other thing. So that might have been another clue for the American people that thought it should go to the States. Yes. But at any rate, Peter has the finishing story on that. But I will say that we it took us 9 hours. One of us kept track of the time, and I did the dyeing with Shirley Lewis, I think it was. And some of it has onion skin dyeing. We wanted to use natural dyes as much as we could, but we knew they wouldn't stand up to color fastness. And one of the references that you showed me today mentioned about the early viewing of that mat and how brilliant the colors were. Yeah. So I know that they had to have been much brighter than they are now. Yeah. And the other odd thing about this mat is the fringe around. It goes the whole way around. I'd never seen anything like that before. So it was meant to be decorative. I would assume it was meant to be decorative from that, and it meant something very special. So we spent our 309 hours working on it. We eventually set it up in Shirley Lindsay's family room area, and 14 of us worked at the hooking of it. And that was another thing. I had them do samplers of their hooking, so to make sure everybody was all the same level, because that was me being me, and it really didn't matter. When we took it off the frame, it had been steam pressed, and it was smooth as anything. When you see it, you'll see that. So it was an interesting, when the dyeing and then the yarns. The Abigail Smith is hooked with 8-ply, and we couldn't get 8-ply. Briggs & Little didn't have an 8-ply. Somewhere in there they had a fire, and it was before it, but anyway, we had to go to PEI, to the woolen mill there to get our yarns. And so for the motifs, the dyeing was done by myself and one other member, I think. And the background is actually hooked with, is it 2 black and 4 of an off-white? So to get the look that we wanted, or maybe the other way around. I think it's 4 black and 2 beige, something like that. So that we use different yarns in our hooking.
Yeah, because we had quite a lot of discussion about, like, we didn't believe that it actually was 8-ply yarn that was being used, because it was so unusual. And I remember us, sort of gingerly opening up the pile to take a look at the, because in some places you can get down to, essentially to the the burlap backing, and some of the brilliant colors, especially in the roses, is still in there.
It's wonderful.
And so we had a debate about, well, do we make it look how it looks now, or do we make it look how we think it looked originally?
Yeah.
So there were a lot of decisions to be made.
Yeah. But we're doing a replica, so it had to be as we saw it. I think that was the bottom line.
Yes, I think the only real major difference that was in the fringe itself, because most of the fringe was worn off, but the evidence of it was still there. And I believe we measured like the longest pieces of the fringe that we could find, and that's how we made that, which was an unusual finishing technique.
It was, definitely.
For the.
But we did a lot of research, and we made various trips down here, and Peter was always very welcoming, and certainly it was a very interesting process, and well worthwhile.
It's sort of been the source of mystery really ever since we got it back in 1944, trying to figure out, okay, once it was established that New Maryland was in New Brunswick and not anywhere in the United States, then there was the mystery of who is Abigail Smith, the maker of this. And so, as I recall, Noel Ireland had undertaken some research that led us to the conclusion back in the 1990s that the mat was likely done by Abigail Smith, who was a 40-year-old school teacher in New Maryland. She taught in a school that her father had built for her.
To teach.
Yeah, and we had we have some returns from the school that list the students and what was being taught, and she taught embroidery and needlework. That was part of the curriculum. We even found her tombstone, which had a dove on it, which was sort of like another link to one of the motifs that was in the mat itself. And so, we were quite
we did a lot of research. I thought, well, gee, we really found this. This is great. And we did find there were 6 Abigail Smiths in our area.
Yes, in 1860 when the mat was made.
Yeah.
Well, about 5 years ago now, we found that a sampler appeared at the York Sunbury Museum in Fredericton. Had been donated there by a girl named Susanna Smith, and dated 1853. That was a little bit revealing because it actually incorporated 3 of the motifs that are found in the Abigail Smith hooked mat. There was the schoolhouse, the eagle, and a vase of flowers, which sort of confirmed your research talking about that the motifs for this likely came from samplers. And here was a sampler from 7 years earlier. And, we went back and I went back and I looked into our artifact file, and really, in fact, in the 1940s, someone had written to us saying that the story that I have on this, that it was made by my grandmother Abigail Smith, and was drawn by my great aunt Susanna Smith for her when they were young women. And so this sampler by Susanna Smith really confirmed that letter that we dismissed, because in 1860 Abigail Smith was 13 years old. And so it just seemed impossible really for someone that young to make something so substantial and so expert, really. But then I think about it and I look back at the samplers
they made are incredible.
From the 18th and early 19th century. Girls are 5 and 6 years old, making embroidered samplers that are just incredible.
So you see, he had that letter here all the time. He didn't tell me.
Well, I was, we were just so pompous in imagining that a teenager wouldn't be capable of this, that it was just sort of dismissed out of hand.
Yeah.
But so it's wonderful to get yourself, get that kind of thing checked. every once in a
it's
while.
wonderful. No, it is
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
So, but it does show how the professionals can work with others, and everybody keeps stirring the pot a little bit, and eventually you hope something turns up, which is really what the mat registry is about, just
Yes.
recording some of this so that not some people don't have to go through what we went through on the Abigail Smith.
That's right. I think that there is a possibility, a slim possibility, that something from the mid to late 19th century may appear. I think that there is also probably more work to be done in community museums and county museums, looking at their
what
mat
they have.
collections.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to see if the stories can come forward. I mean, we're fortunate in having the Abigail Smith mat being identified as to maker and as to place and as to date. I mean, and that's what sort of makes it the touchstone of rug hooking in Canada. I think there are some earlier mats that have dates on them. I think there's one from 1855 or something like that, but we don't know exactly where it was made or who made it. So we know that, but it seems that 1850s, 1860s is as far back as we are able to get in terms of hooked mats. Even from some of the evidence that's coming forward, I've scoured diaries, I've looked through the prize lists from the county fairs to see when people were submitting things for fancy work, and when that was, and that seems to appear in the 1860s, and by 1870. Hooked mats is a term that's being used in one of the categories at the at the county fairs. There are some other important developments that I personally would like to see represented in the museum's collection, like the what was going on in St. Andrews with Grace Helen Mowat in the 1920s. Some of the mats that were being made by women out in the community there. I also know that Peggy Nicol MacLeod, the Canadian painter, was hooking and making designs that Madge Smith, through her shop, was having made in the 1940s. We have Peggy Nicol MacLeod's patterns, the designs that she put forward for those mats, but I have yet to see one of those mats that had survived. So there are things that I'm looking for.
Well, maybe if you're able to use those patterns, we could earn some money for the museum.
Yes. Well, we have a collection of about 25 mats, which is not a large collection at all. It's really not enough for you to be able to start making generalizations about hooking in the province, or even during a particular time period. A number of them we don't know who made them. There are two other mats that I think are quite important, or seem to get people's heart beating a little bit when we talk about them, and those are the corn husk mats that we have in the museum's collection. One of them dates, we believe, from the 1860s, and the other one is dated February 1900.
Okay.
So we know that essentially that last quarter of the 19th century, that this sort of little anomalous thing was happening in Kings and Queens County in southern New Brunswick, where instead of using fragments of cloth or using wool yarn, that strips of corn husk was actually used to hook the mats.
And no sign of, like I have a jute or burlap mat that's hooked with that, and a bit of yarn in the middle, and I bought it in Quebec because I was told it was hooked in New Brunswick.
Yes.
But that's all I've known, and even that's just people talking, you know. So I think there was a lot going on. We just don't have the proof of any of it, so that makes it more difficult.
I mean, I think the other challenge that we have is the sort of the influx of commercially made, commercially prepared
definitely.
patterns and kits that were available out of Maine and out of Nova Scotia that were widely distributed, so that they could they were appearing everywhere. I know that one of the things that's sort of come out of the mat registry, or seems to be appearing out of the mat registry, is the beginnings of the Acadian mat hooking.
Yes.
Which appears to be like just after the First World War, we start to see hooked mats entering into the sort of the craft tradition.
They do, and we see a lot of the printed mats, the blue nose, the Garrett patterns, and some of the other ones from the States. But again, they're not going back that far. They were certainly used, so as I sold through Eaton's and that sort of thing. Yes. But when the Acadians seem to be use more imagination. Now some of those we've seen are also patterns, but quite frequently they're original designs, which is really good. Yeah.
I think there was a much stronger weaving tradition in the Acadian communities that lasted longer than in many Anglophone communities. And so one of the things that you see are a lot of the woven rag mats that are used in Acadia, like like the Catalan. And so I think that it was a different tradition in terms of floor coverings than the hooked mat. Yeah. Well, I think that the New Brunswick Mat Registry is a highlight in the history of mats in New Brunswick. I think this whole idea of a group of people getting together to capture this information now, especially with the sort of the people that are still around from the can remember from the 1920s and the 1930s when things were being done, and sort of that little hiatus that happens, I think, around the Second World War, where it sort of falls off a bit, and then the gradual revival of it. And I think that having people passionately involved in documenting that story and capturing that picture of hooked mats and hooking in New Brunswick is really a highlight of the history.
Yeah, it is, and it's wonderful because we get a chance to experience the history of New Brunswick through this medium and know and the women. I think it's very important to realize it was basically the women. There were some men. There still are some men today, but they really, this mat registry is telling the history of New Brunswick and the women that made the mats. So it's part of our history.
What is it? You forget the past at your peril.
Exactly. Yes.
So absolutely. And I think that's what's important about this. And it's to me, it speaks a little bit about the sort of the professionalization, if you want, of the craft. That it's not something that's done not merely, but as a functional object. That there's multifacets to this, and that there is a community of people who are involved in it. It does have a function, but it is also a mode of expression that it is an art form in and of itself. It's one of those things that can cross so many boundaries. That to me, that's one of the good things about a place like New Brunswick. Is that interaction between the fine art and the fine craft, and the sort of the world that's in between, that straddles or crosses over, that there's so much space for exchange, and that's, to me, that's where great art and great craft often happen.
Well, it's already taken on a future because it's not going to be forgotten. The old craft will never be forgotten, but we've moved ahead with different designs, more free designing, and you'll find them on the walls in a lot of houses. Like some of my own pieces they were bought to go on the wall, and they'll never go on the floor as long as that person owns it anyway. So it's become a craft art that is going to be appreciated more as an art form. And we're using it to make clothes and purses. I have a bag with me today that's decorated with the hooking. And people are using it to make boots and all kinds of things. So it is moving. I'm still talking, it's creative and it's expression. It's an art form that you can put on the wall, but also can satisfy your needs as to decorating yourself or the floor. So I think it's just going to continue.
I think it's going to be a wonderful problem for the curators that come after me, that there's such a wide, as Doris says, this creative approach to using this technique, at the same time as an appreciation of what's gone before.
Yes.
And to me, when those two things go hand in hand, that is when you end up with really high quality work.